I will now call to order the Tuesday, November 5th, 2013 meeting of the Sioux Falls City Council Fiscal Committee. Welcome to all of you here at Carnegie Town Hall and those watching us on CityLink or at siouxfalls.org. We'll begin with, I would accept a motion to either approve or any additions or corrections to the minutes of the September 3rd meeting.
Move to approve.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. Motion carries. We have one item today. We are going to have a presentation by Director of Finance Tracy Turbeck on debt service management. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Tracy Turbeck with the Finance Office. Great to be here, and I can't think of a more exciting topic for a snowy Tuesday afternoon. Can you? Pretty good stuff. I was asked to come over and talk about debt management, how the city administers debt, how we monitor the level of city debt, how we go about making decisions. So with that in mind, I sat down and I didn't put together a PowerPoint presentation. I wanted to keep it a little less formal than that and hopefully have some good questions, I guess, when we're finished. But I do want to, I prepared some areas that I wanted to talk about and just kind of review to provide background and kind of a foundation for discussion on city debt. Some of the areas I want to cover, talk just in general terms about when it's appropriate for the city, for any city and in particular for our city, to issue debt. When do we issue debt? When don't we? Some of the more specific issues related to debt management, the types of tools that are in the toolbox when it comes to borrowing money, considerations that we think are important when the decisions are made, whether or not to borrow money, review kind of our current debt situation, some of the things that we touch on, some of the monitoring of debt, some of the things that many of which I know you're aware of, and then talk about a little bit about the future, what we see in the near-term future in terms of the city debt. So with that, I'll jump into kind of more of a philosophical policy or practice that the city has in terms of when we do or when we don't issue debt. And while there's nothing to prohibit it, the city, to my knowledge, has never and really should never borrow money for operating expenses. That's kind of the federal government's model of finance, and they borrow money to operate their day-to-day operations, and that's just a cycle that they, as I think we all understand, cannot spin out of. So the city, no well-run city will ever borrow money for operating expenses or even short-lived assets. We don't borrow money for equipment purchases, for example. I think there probably have been times in the past when maybe relatively smaller purchases of equipment have been acquired through either lease financing or some sort of a lease purchase agreement, which is another form of debt. But currently we don't have any of that, and I certainly would not advocate, given our strong financial position, that we would ever borrow money for operating expenses or what I would term as short-lived assets. Of course, the primary reason the city does issue debt are for capital projects, and they really fall into a couple categories: general government types of projects, for general infrastructure, bridges. 41st Street Bridge, for example, was rebuilt utilizing debt. Drainage systems it's not unusual for cities to borrow funds for drainage systems, which we have also done in the past. Buildings, as you know, libraries, the West Side Library was built and financed with sales tax revenue bonds. The law enforcement facility was financed. It has since been paid off. So there are a number of general kind of assets. The event center is a community facility. Obviously, that you're aware that that was paid with borrowing funds. And then the second general category, of course, are our enterprise funds, where we've got, it's essentially a model of a private business where we've got charges for services or goods that we're selling, like drinking water, that are rates are set at a level to cover the costs of not only operating that, but also servicing any debt that's necessary to put the infrastructure into place. And so our enterprise systems do carry some amount of debt, and I'll touch on that a little bit more later. We do have funds borrowed in our water and sewer fund, a relatively small amount in our landfill as well. And the third potential reason where a city might want to borrow money is to refinance existing debt, and that has happened on occasion in the past. The most recent, the only one that I'm actually aware of that the City of Sioux Falls has done was in 2010. The outstanding entertainment tax bonds were refinanced with the intention of gaining interest rate savings. Interest rates on the outstanding bonds were higher than the prevailing market rates at that time, and so considerable savings were gained by refinancing. So generally the city really only issues debt for capital projects and for refinancing previously issued debt. So as a kind of a philosophical look at when it's appropriate for the city to issue debt, I think it's important, you folks understand this, but it's important for the public to understand that by and large, the city uses a pay-as-you-go approach to financing our capital improvements. A significant portion of, if you look at our current 5-year capital program, 87% of the improvements that are planned, the capital expenditures that are planned over the next 5 years, are going to be paid for with something other than borrowing money. It's going to be a pay-as-you-go, primarily from the cash that's generated from our second penny sales tax or our enterprise funds. There'll be a small amount of some grant funds mixed in there as well, but generally a very small share of the hundreds of millions of dollars that will be invested in capital improvements over the next 5 years. Very small percentage will be financed with debt. So generally, when pay-as-you-go is not practical, if a project is so large that it really isn't feasible to gather that much cash in one fiscal year, that's an appropriate time to consider issuing debt, in particular for projects that provide very long-term benefits. And normally we would look for whatever improvements we're making to outlive the life of the bonds that we're selling to issue or to finance the project. So, for example, the event center bonds will be paid off in 22 years from the time they were issued. That facility will certainly serve the community for many, many years beyond that time frame. So that's certainly one indicator that it's a prudent approach to finance that type of a project. Another kind of a philosophical consideration is really a fairness issue. I think we typically will agree that generally speaking it's good for people that are benefiting from a project or from a improvement to those that are benefiting. It's appropriate for those folks to pay for it. And in government finance, that term, and when it comes to borrowing money and capital improvements, the label they put on that is intergenerational equity. So it's appropriate to borrow the money and pay it off over the next 20 years, for example, or 25 years for a project that those folks that are living here for the next 20 or 25 years are going to benefit from. So that's kind of the concept of intergenerational equity. And if you look at any of the projects that the city has financed in recent years, I think you'll see that certainly makes sense. The library that we just opened out on the west side was financed with debt that will be paid off over the next 20 years, and the people that are living here in the community utilizing that library will be the ones that are paying for it, rather than the people that have been here for the past 20 years, if it took us that long to save up the money and pay cash. So there's kind of a fairness aspect to that. And you can, as I say, you can use that same example for the Lewis and Clark bonds that were issued. The folks that will be here over the next 30 years benefiting from that are those that are paying for the benefit of it. Getting a little more into the specifics of debt management, talking about some of the types of debt that are available to the city. General obligation bonds are one avenue that the city has to finance projects. The city currently doesn't have any general obligation bonds outstanding. And that's, if you hear the term full faith and credit associated with municipal financing, that's a general obligation bond. Basically, the city pledges our full faith and our credit, no matter where those revenues would have to come from to repay those bonds. That's a general obligation, and that's the benefit of that is that it's a very, very safe investment from an investor standpoint, and so the city would be rewarded with a more favorable interest rate in terms of borrowing those dollars. So that's the attraction of a general obligation bond. The downside in South Dakota anyway, general obligation bonds are almost always repaid with a special property tax levy, so that's seen as a negative from the perspective of many people. The other caveat with general obligation bonds is that it does require a vote of the people. It does impact their property, and so the state constitution and state statutes require that general obligation bonds go to a vote and require a 60% approval. So the city doesn't have the authority to issue GO bonds without a voter approval at 60%. The almost all of the current debt that the city has are in the form of revenue bonds, and that's kind of a general category of bonds that are issued and are repaid using a specific revenue stream. There's no full faith and credit pledge associated with revenue bonds. It's really tied and secured by a specific revenue stream that's identified at the time the bonds are sold, and the most common ones we have are sales tax bonds. Revenue bonds don't require a public vote. They are authorized by ordinance by the City Council. As your finance director, I don't have the authority to issue sales tax bonds. The mayor can't do it. It requires the City Council to approve an ordinance authorizing the issuance of revenue bonds. They are typically distinguished by the source of repayment, so we refer to them as sales tax bonds or water revenue bonds or water reclamation revenue bonds, and so that's typically the distinction from one type of revenue bond to another would be the source of revenue that will be used to repay them. We've got a number of alternatives. In sales tax, I've mentioned, we've in the past, the city has issued entertainment tax revenue bonds. Those will be retired next year. We've got a number of outstanding issues that are secured and being repaid with our second penny sales tax revenues. Theoretically anyway, another alternative would be to sell revenue bonds that would be repaid by our first penny sales tax. A number of cities, that's fairly common around the country for cities to utilize a sales tax revenue of any kind to secure bonds. And then, of course, our enterprise fund charges. I mentioned some of them for water and sewer. Very common to secure those revenue bonds with those very reliable revenue streams. Some of the less common ones, although we've got some storm drainage revenue bonds that are outstanding. Some of those are in the form of state revolving fund loans, as are some of our sewer, sanitary sewer or water reclamation bonds are really state revolving fund loans, essentially the same thing as a revenue bond. And then we've got one issue outstanding of a tax increment revenue bond that's secured solely by the revenues from a tax increment district. Some of the other less common and really infrequently used sources of borrowing would be like a capital lease that I mentioned before. That's another kind of tool in the toolbox. Typically when you see municipalities utilizing capital leases for buying equipment, it's kind of an indicator that there's reaching the point where they're struggling financially. They've got to look at those kinds of alternatives for financing relatively small purchases. Some of the things we look at, and I think that are important considerations, are really break down into three categories. When the city's considering issuing debt, first of all are the legal limitations. There are limits under the state constitution as to how much constitutional debt a city can take on. There are really three the Constitution identifies three different areas. The first is a kind of a general purpose or any purpose, a limit of 5% of our assessed value of property within the city. So that's, as the city grows, as the tax base grows, that limit continues to increase, but it's by Constitution set at 5% of the value of the assessed value of property in the city. There's another separate limit of 10% for water and sewer projects. 10% again applied to the assessed value of taxable property in the city. But in order for debt to be counted under that limit, it has to be approved by voters. So we don't have any of that. That's fairly relatively uncommon, I think, in cities across the state, but it is another alternative. And then there's another very specific limit related to electrical system improvements. It's 8% of the assessed value of property for electrical system improvements. Those last two, for the water and sewer and for electric, do require votes, a vote of the people. So that's another reason they're generally not made use of. Aside from legal considerations, there are a lot of financial considerations, obviously, when considering whether or not to issue debt. Affordability and the degree to which we give up financial flexibility are really primary concerns or considerations when we're thinking of issuing debt. Most of our debt relates to revenue bonds, so we'll look carefully at the historical revenue growth for whatever type of revenue we're looking at backing bonds with. Look at other demands on that revenue stream within our water and sewer utility systems. You have to look at the gamut of what kind of demands are on that revenue stream. We look at what other projects are planned that might be disrupted if we do take on a project and the obligation to repay bonds. Retirement of existing debt, that was a key element in the financing plan for the event center. We knew that there were going to be some additional bonds being retired, and so sales tax dollars that had been going into paying those bonds would no longer be needed for that purpose, so it could be shifted when that time came to event center bonds, and so that was an important financial consideration. Debt service coverage ratios, bond ratings, the interest rate environment in general are certainly important financial considerations. And then the third area really is more kind of in your folks' realm, and that's taxpayer acceptance. There's a limit, even if people aren't asked to vote on bonds. You folks provide the kind of the bellwether on how accepting the public is of debt for particular projects. In the case of the event center, that was a little bit unique, where that was put to a vote, even though the public wasn't voting to authorize the issuance of bonds. It was pretty clearly an indication of their willingness as a community to accept that. Just quickly to review our current debt and looking at the most recent monthly financial report, which is as of the end of September. Of course, as I mentioned, we've got no general obligation bonds outstanding. We've got no sales tax bonds outstanding that are secured by our first penny. Our second penny, we've got about $204 million of bonds outstanding that are secured with our second, or being repaid with our second penny dollars. $5.5 million of entertainment tax bonds. Water, sewer, as you know, have a considerable amount of debt outstanding that's being repaid with revenues from those sources. And then really a very small amount in landfill, our storm drainage fund, and I mentioned the tax increment district that has some small amount. So that's really the extent of the city's debt outstanding as of the end of September. All those things added together, about $396 million of outstanding debt. The debt that the city does have is monitored on a regular basis in a lot of different ways. I mentioned the monthly financial report. In that report that you get from the finance department every month, there is a page in there that lists every bond issue outstanding, what the original issue was, how much is currently outstanding, what the interest rates are. So You folks have the opportunity, as does the public, to see that information updated on a monthly basis. The comprehensive annual financial report, our audited financial statements, have a lot of information each year when this is published, audited information that's provided to you and to the public. There's about 5 or 6 pages in the footnotes that deal strictly with debt, all the different bond issues, how they're secured, what the upcoming payment schedules are. So there's a considerable amount of information disclosed to the public in that. Again, the CPA firm that does the city's independent audit reviews that information and passes issues an opinion on the fairness of its presentation. Internal audit, our own internal audit staff will review the CAFR, and one of the things I know that they look at in 2011, they looked at the CAFR and they do an analysis of the debt reported in the CAFR. I know that's part of their 2013 plan as well, to review the 2012 CAFR. So I'm not sure when they have that scheduled to come up on their work plan, but I know that's on their audit plan for this year as well. So the monitoring is not just by the finance department. It really cuts across a number of different aspects. Some of the things that we look at in monitoring debt, and I know the internal audit does this, external auditors do this as well on a number of counts, to determine how manageable the city's debt is. One very common way is to look at, on a per capita basis, how much debt does the city have, and compare ourselves with other communities. I think I've provided the information in the past to the council at times. I know internal audit, that's something that they look at as well when they do their CAFR review. And looking at this information was compiled as of July of this past summer, July 13. Sioux Falls per capita debt outstanding was about $2,500, $2,527. That put us actually below most of the communities in this region that we compare ourselves with, like Des Moines, Lincoln, Cedar Rapids, Fargo, Sioux City, and Rochester, Minnesota, all had higher per capita debt amounts. The only one on the list that was actually a little bit below was Omaha, was at $2,506. So just almost the same per capita debt level as we have here in the city of Sioux Falls. So that's just one benchmark we look at to measure how manageable our debt levels are here in Sioux Falls compared to other communities. Debt service costs, the annual payments that are required as a percent of our budget, that's another issue or item number that we monitor. The tax-supported principal and interest payments in our 2014 budget that was just approved are just under 5% of the total budget. When we add in the utility debt, the enterprise fund debt, that's about another 5%. So overall, in our total citywide budget, we're spending in 2014 about 10% of our budget on principal and interest payments. Debt service coverage ratios, that's another point that we monitor. That's dealing with revenue bonds or revenue-backed debt. The council recognized that as a pretty key indicator a number of years ago and established a policy that for second penny sales tax bonds that they wanted to maintain at least a 2 times coverage, and that essentially means that the amount of revenue that we're seeing from our second penny sales tax should always be twice what our payments are that are coming out of that. So the council never wants to go beyond using half of our second penny sales tax revenues for debt service costs. And so that's a fairly conservative approach compared to what bondholders require. Typically, when we sell sales tax bonds, there's a provision in the bond agreement with the investors that says that if we ever issue additional bonds, because the more bonds that are repaid from that same revenue stream affects those original bondholders, they're comfortable with us issuing more bonds if we don't go over 1.5 times, or in many cases 1.25 times. So that's kind of the benchmark, a typical benchmark. The city here in Sioux Falls has gone well beyond that and said we want to maintain at least 2 times coverage of our debt service payments on our second penny sales taxes. So we're well below that. The actual payments in 2012 represented about a 3 times coverage. So we've got a long ways to go. We're not nowhere near approaching that limitation that the council established a number of years ago. Some of the other ratios that we look at, net asset ratios, net assets, which would take into account the amount of liabilities that the city has in relation to our total assets, not a lot different than what a business would look at. Long-term debt ratio, looking at our debt to total assets. Those are a couple things too that are covered most recently in the internal audit report. They make those same comparisons. I think one of the most objective indications of whether or not the city's debt level is manageable and affordable really comes from the bond ratings, bond rating agencies. When we go out, when we did go out and to sell event center bonds, they take a careful look not only at the city organization and our own financial condition and our financial performance, but the entire community as well, and how well the local economy is. So the sales tax debt that the city has is rated AA2 by Moody's. There are only 2 higher ratings available, a AA1 and AAA. So we're very, very close to the top. I think there's something like 20 different levels of ratings that Moody's has, and so we're 3rd from the top out of all those possible ratings. And they're very, very conservative and have become even more conservative in recent years and handing out high bond ratings. So I think that speaks pretty highly, and that's one certainly very important thing that we look at in representing how strong the city is financially. The future, looking at that in terms of the 5-year capital plan that in September the council approved, how much new borrowing is expected within that 2014 through 2018 5-year time frame. There are a number of projects that are planned to be financed. Adding all of those up, it would be about $58 million over that 5-year time frame. Most of that will be in our water reclamation fund to continue to improve the wastewater system. Over that same 5-year time frame, based on the currently outstanding debt that we have and the payments that we're making, we will retire over $120 million of debt. So even though the plan calls for issuing $58 million of additional debt during that same 5-year time frame, we'll be retiring $120 million or 30% of our currently outstanding debt. So that is a key indicator as well in terms of affordability when we look at issuing that $58 million. If those projects really come to fruition and we really do ultimately borrow that amount of money, we've recaptured over that same 5-year time frame more borrowing capacity than what we're using. Over the next 10 years, kind of the same thing, more than $217 million out of the currently outstanding debt will be repaid. So that's over half of our currently outstanding debt will be repaid over the next 10 years. And for a homeowner, 10 years might seem like a long time, but in city government, that's really almost the blink of an eye. It's a very short period of time, 10 years, to think that within that next 10 years we will retire more than half of the debt we currently have outstanding. That's, I think, speaks volumes about how quickly we are recapturing that financial flexibility. So, in summary, just to kind of recap my comments, the city continues to use debt financing very prudently. Most of the capital needs that we do have are met on a pay-as-you-go basis. Under the 5-year plan, 87% of those improvements and capital expenditures are going to be covered on a pay-as-you-go basis without borrowing dollars. We do only borrow money for the very large projects where the assets will outlive the debt by many years, and I can't say it often enough, but that we never use borrowing for operations or short-term assets, and that's, I think, something that maybe goes underappreciated by just folks in the community. We've got a variety of options to choose from when we do borrow funds. We've traditionally, and because of our tax structure here in South Dakota, most cities are the same in that they rely very heavily on revenue-backed debt from those dedicated revenue streams. utility revenues, and second penny sales tax dollars. Got no general obligation debt. There are no debt payments that the city makes that come from or that use general property tax dollars. I think that's important for the public to understand. And we don't use any of our first penny revenues to make debt payments. We do report to you each month an updated, include in our report an updated sheet on all of the debt outstanding. I think in general it's fair to say the city's policies that have been enacted by the council, as well as the practices that have been put into effect, are really pretty conservative, even by South Dakota standards. And the city debt at this time is very, very manageable. It's low on a per capita basis, low on a percent of budget basis. The revenue streams that are being used to repay our debt are very solid and growing, getting stronger. Balance sheet ratios that we have are very solid. We've got excellent bond ratings that objectively reflects the financial strength that the city has. Over the next 5 years, the debt retirements will outpace any new borrowing that we do. So the capacity and the financial flexibility for the future is being recaptured very, very quickly. So those are my remarks, and I'm hoping that kind of lays some of the groundwork for pretty exciting stuff, isn't it? As I said, as promised, happy to try to answer whatever questions you folks have, for those of you that are still awake.
Thank you, Tracy. This really was very informative, and you really got it down to a very understandable presentation. Councilor Karski, you have a question.
Not a question as much as a comment, and it is exciting stuff in a kind of a very dry sort of way.
Some of us.
You answered one of the questions I did have, and that was over the next 5 years, which we project our budget out. I was curious what we would be retiring and what we would be anticipating to bring on, and that's encouraging that we would be retiring probably at a rate of more than 2 to 1 of what we would be bringing on. So
Yep.
Good information. Thank you.
Councilor Jameson.
Thank you. I have a question on the upcoming debt, the existing debt that we have for the levy project that we did.
Mm-hmm.
I think if I saw in the financial report as well, the monthly updates, that none of that is retirable or callable until 18 or 19. Is that?
That's right. The bonds that were issued in 2009 to finance the flood control improvements will not be callable for a number of years. I believe it's I've got that information here somewhere, but I think you're right. It's 17 or 18, so another 5 years roughly before those are callable.
One of the other questions, if I could, the couple maybe.
Yeah, go on.
The 9.7 million that we reserved back from the Corps, would the appropriate place be? I think you're going to be coming sometime with some recommendations, but when there isn't any debt that can be paid down, if we were to put that money into an interest-bearing account, is that an option? And if it was, what kind of interest rate would that? Do we have any money in an interest-bearing savings account, I guess?
We try to keep everything in an interest-bearing. It just, in recent years, it doesn't bear a whole lot of interest, but we try to squeeze every dollar we can. So yeah, that money will earn interest as long as the city holds on to it. And I don't want to get ahead of your question, but I know because of the circumstances under which the city has received that $9.8 million, there's interest in somehow tying that to the debt obligation that was incurred to advance those dollars to the federal government, or at least in some way relieve the obligation to use sales tax dollars to repay some of the city's sales tax bonds. If we can somehow find a way to use those dollars, that $9.8 million, to relieve pressure, if you want to call it that, on the sales tax fund, that will at least, if we can't directly call the bonds, if we utilize the money to make the future payments on the bonds, or sit on it for 5 years until we can call the bonds, those are all options I think that can certainly be considered. under normal circumstances, as you guys know, when we get to the end of the year and we've got unobligated money in our capital fund, typically the only discussion is, well, what are we going to spend it on? And I think that's certainly a consideration here as well. You can choose to put that money into the capital program and increase our capital program, move projects up, do that kind of thing. But I think there is a legitimate reason to not only consider that, but also look at ways where we might be able to tie that federal reimbursement money somehow back to applying it to debt payments or avoiding debt payments. I mean, we've got some planned borrowing in our capital plan coming up, and certainly the least expensive borrowing typically is money you never have to borrow in the first place. So I think those are things that the council ought to be thinking about. And I do hope to get something out. I've got a memo mostly drafted to go out to you sometime this week. I'm hoping that kind of lays out at least some of my thoughts on things that you ought to be considering and what are some viable options for utilizing those dollars that have been reimbursed to the city.
Did you have another?
Maybe just, so yeah, I think you clarified it that there are no restrictions with the funds that were returned to us on how it can be used from some federal
Right,
connections.
there are no strings attached, essentially.
Right, okay, thank you.
Any other questions? I have a couple. Do you see us in the future refinancing any of our current debt? And is it typical when you do refinance the debt that you lengthen the payoff period, or do you try to keep it within the same payoff parameters?
I'll answer the last part first. I don't believe we would ever extend out beyond the original maturity date when we refinance. I'm not sure why. I guess should never say never, but I mean that's something that could be done, but I don't believe it would ever be a prudent thing that we would want to do. Normally when we would refinance, it would be strictly to pay it off either on that same schedule or in a shorter time frame, but really the primary reason is to take advantage of interest rate savings. And it's hard to say with our existing debt if any of those will ever be refinanced. If interest rates either go down or never change, as long as they don't go up too much, I would say probably all of them will be refinanced at some point. Because the way they're structured, the bonds are in different maturities, and so in a 20-year bond, you'll have some of the bonds that are maturing the first year, some the second year, some the third year, and as you get further out, and you probably understand this, but as you get further out in those maturities, those are generally have a higher rate of interest on them. And so if you're 10 years into paying off a 20-year bond, you've paid off all those bonds that carry the lowest interest, and what are left are the highest interest bonds. And so when you get to that 10-year point, even if interest rates have not changed, you can refinance that, pay off all the bonds that were really 11 to 20-year terms and replace them with bonds that are 1 to 10-year terms. And so you move your interest rate down onto a lower part of the yield curve and generate a lot of savings that way. So the only thing that would prevent that is if interest rates go up so much that at the time you're looking at refinancing that you basically don't have any savings, because the new debt that you would take out, even though it would be shorter term, would be a higher interest rate than the previous bonds. I hope that answers it.
No, it does. Thank you. You talked about that the previous councils had determined that not more than half of the second penny should be used for debt service. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that's the way I said it. That's not exactly the way the council set the policy. It was basically that they didn't want to ever issue bonds, second penny sales tax bonds, that would result in less than a 2 times coverage. So
is that in ordinance, or is that just a policy?
I don't believe it is an ordinance. I think it was a policy or a resolution that was adopted, but it's been certainly followed.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Tracy, thank you very much.
Great.
It really was very
Well, thank
informative.
you. I appreciate your attention and your questions.
The agenda now calls for open discussion. Is there any open discussion? Counselor Jamison.
You know, just thinking about the 9.7 that's coming and the small interest that it would bear due to the interest rates that are payable to the city. I was thinking about how else to leverage that money. You know, I like the idea of using it for debt service, but I'm just wondering if this body would be interested in perhaps challenging Darren Smith, the Economic Development Office of the city, as well as the Sioux Falls Development Foundation, Forward Sioux Falls, even maybe the Chamber, but somehow ask them if they've got a project or something that is happening that, because if we earn 2% on $10 million, that's $200,000 in a year. But if those guys had something going on that some of that money could be utilized for a development project, that could be a major return to the community, this money is really special. We've never had this kind of, that I can remember, I don't know that we've ever had this kind of an opportunity. And so I'm just thinking that maybe we should think about challenging those guys to maybe just at least ask them if they've got any ideas or possibilities that we could consider.
Any comments?
Not all of it. Don't get me wrong, 9.7. I'm just saying maybe part of it could really maybe tip a deal that we could get. You know, I've been involved enough to know that I know they struggle with, and we've heard about this, some of their incentives in order to get something to happen. So anyway, just some thoughts, that's all.
That would be something that we would need to take before the entire council, really.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that it would behoove us to wait for Tracy's memo to see what comes out of that and then add your suggestion into the discussion. Counselor Karski?
I always appreciate creative thinking, and being in business, I've always been one to keep my options open. So I think that's a fantastic idea. I'm not in a hurry to spend this money by any means. 9.7 million, we were told we were anticipating 58 million in new debt over the next 5 years. I mean, that's instead of 58 million, now we're down to 49 million. So just reducing the amount we have to borrow in the future by keeping this money available too. So just keeping our options open.
Any other discussion? Well, again, thank you to Director Turbeck and thank you to the committee. I would now entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 The meeting is adjourned.